Okay, so we are going to read The Story of the World, Volume 3, Early and Modern Times, from Elizabeth I to the 49ers, by Susan Weiss Bauer. Yes, we have read the other two volumes, and I decided it's time to read chapters so that other people can find them, because there's different weeks and stuff where it's just helpful to be able to look up and find a chapter. So I hope this helps somebody, and here I am contributing. Okay, so the first chapter is chapter 1, A World of Empires, the Holy Roman Empire. And so there's also a map, the Empire of Ferdinand and Philip. The empires of Ferdinand and Philip. Okay, imagine that you're a world traveler in the year 1600. You've spent the last 20 years journeying around the world. You've slept in Arabian tents, European palaces, and Native American longhouses. You've eaten fermented fish sauce in Rome, calf's intestine pudding in England, sugar-coated beets in Wittenberg, and gilded boar's head in France. You only have 2 teeth left. The rest fell out because of scurvy and the sugared beets. And on your last journey to Iceland, you lost 3 toes to frostbite. You've been bitten by a camel in Asia, a cobra in India, and a water moccasin in North America. In your travels around the world, you've seen 2 flags, one with a red cross on a white background, and the other bearing a 2-headed eagle, all over the world. You've seen the red cross and the 2-headed eagle in Spain and Portugal and all over Europe. From the Alps up to the soggy coast of the Netherlands, you've seen these flags flying over settlements in North America, South America, and even in the Philippines. No matter where you go, the red cross and the 2-headed eagle are there. The 2 kings who fly these flags, Philip II of Spain and Ferdinand I of the Holy Roman Empire, are the nephew and uncle. Their nephew and uncle. Imagine you and one of your uncles being rulers. Huh? 100 years, Ferdinand, okay. They are nephew and uncle, and they rule over an enormous part of the world because of one very fortunate little boy. 100 years before our story begins, in the year 1500, this fortunate baby was born in a cold stone palace in northern Europe. His father was the king of the Netherlands, his grandfather ruled over lands in Germany, and his other grandfather was the king of Spain. This baby, who was named Charles, had 3 kings in his family. When Charles was only 6, his father died, and Charles became king of the Netherlands. When he was 16, his Spanish grandfather died and left him the throne of Spain. When he was 19, his German grandfather died, and he became king over the German lands. Charles was still a teenager, but he was a teenager with 3 thrones. Can you imagine inheriting 3 thrones? But Charles wanted even more. He wanted the title Holy Roman Emperor. Rena, please. 1500 years before Charles was born, the Roman Empire spread across Europe and down into Africa. Everyone who lived inside the empire's borders was expected to follow Rome's law and to live in peace. This Roman peace lasted until barbarians invaded. Then the Roman Empire collapsed. For the next 500 years, warring peoples fought with each other all over Europe, until a great king named Charlemagne came to the throne of France. Charlemagne conquered the nearby German lands and added them to his own territory. He passed laws to keep his kingdom peaceful. His empire became so large that the Pope, the leader of the Christian church in the West, called the Catholic Church, held a special church service and proclaimed Charlemagne to be the Roman Emperor. But the Roman Empire had been destroyed centuries ago. So what did this mean? It meant that Charlemagne's new empire would keep the peace over a large part of Europe, just as the Roman Empire had done in ancient times. And since Charlemagne was a Christian, his new Roman Empire could also spread Christianity through the world. That's why Charlemagne eventually became known as the Holy Roman Emperor. Charles wanted to be known as the Holy Roman Emperor too, but first he had to convince the Pope to hold a special service proclaiming him Holy Roman Emperor. And the Pope wasn't sure he wanted to give Charles this title and the power that went along with it. Charles already ruled most of Europe. If Charles became even stronger, what would happen to the power of the Pope? The Pope wasn't alone in his worries. The King of France was afraid that Charles might invade France, and the princes who ruled over Italy were also anxious to keep their independence from Charles. So the King of France, the Pope, and the Italian princes all joined together to fight against Charles and his armies. Charles wasn't discouraged. If he couldn't convince the Pope to crown him emperor willingly, he would resort to force. His strategy was simple and shocking. For years, Charles had oppressed the Protestant Christians who lived in his territories. These Protestants believed that the Catholic Church was corrupt and that the Pope did not have the authority to tell all Christians how to worship and live. Charles had put Protestants in jail, taken away their land, and executed them. But Charles knew that these Protestants would be willing to fight against the Pope, so he hired an army of German Protestants and sent them, along with his own soldiers, to attack Rome. Rana, please, shush. This angry army, called the German Fury, marched down to Rome and surrounded it. The Pope's soldiers were outnumbered. They were outnumbered. They fired a few shots from the walls with their old battered cannons, but invaders broke down the gates and streamed through the city. The Pope and his soldiers retreated to a fortress inside the city and barred themselves in. For 8 months, the Pope remained a prisoner inside this fortress, while the German fury stormed through Rome, burning, killing, and stealing treasure. Meanwhile, Charles was still up in Spain, pretending that he knew nothing about the attack on Rome. He sent a message to the Pope claiming that the German fury had acted without his permission. "I'm outraged," Charles exclaimed. "How could such a thing happen?" Did the Pope believe this message? We don't know, but we do know that the Pope agreed to hold the special service which would crown Charles Holy Roman Emperor. In return, Charles helped the Pope to fend off the fury. Now, Charles could describe himself as the King of the Romans, King of Spain, Sicily, Jerusalem, the Indies, and the mainland on the far side of the Atlantic. Archduke of Austria, Duke of Burgundy and Athens, Count of Habsburg and Flanders, Lord of Asia and Africa. But despite his fancy titles, Charles had plenty of problems. He had spent years and years of his reign fighting, and the wars cost money. He was growing poorer and poorer. Within his own kingdoms, Catholics and Protestants were constantly battling with each other, and his Protestant subjects no longer wanted to obey Charles' decrees. 24 years after the Pope crowned him as emperor, Charles decided that he could no longer rule his empire. Dressed in black, leaning on the arm of one of his favorite noblemen, he rose from his throne and told his followers, "I have done my best to protect my country and my faith, but I am too weak and ill to continue the struggle. So I must resign my throne. I will give Spain, the Netherlands, and my Italian lands to my son Philip." All of Charles' followers wept as the emperor sank back onto his throne. 1 year later, Charles V gave the rest of his empire to his brother Ferdinand, who became the Holy Roman Emperor in his place. Charles went to live in a monastery where he spent his days praying and reading. He died less than 2 years later. The fortunate little boy had lost his kingdoms, but his brother Ferdinand and his son Philip now ruled over the richest kingdoms in the West, and their actions would change the world. The riches of Spain. A young boy stands in a dark cave. A heavy sack leans against his bare legs. Beneath his feet, he feels damp, slick clay and rough ridges of stone. Sweat runs down his face. Ahead of him, dim torchlight flickers in the blackness. The hollow sound of metal picks hacking away at mountain rock rings through the dark. He turns around and sees a tunnel sloping sharply up toward a faraway gleam of daylight. He bends down to lift the sack. Needle-edged pieces of stone jut through its rough sides and scrape against his arms and back. He starts to struggle up the tunnel, bent almost double by the weight and gasping for breath, but the air is so warm and foul that he can barely pull it into his lungs. He isn't much older than you, and he works in a South American mine, collecting gold for Philip II, the King of Spain. The Spanish came to South America the very first time by accident. For hundreds of years, traders from Spain and other European countries had traveled east, right on your map. to India, where they bought cloves, nutmeg, and pepper. But the long and difficult road to India lay through dry deserts and over steep mountain ridges. So an adventurer named Christopher Columbus set sail for Europe and went west, left on your map, hoping to go all the way around the world and reach India from the other side. When he caught sight of land, he was sure that he had reached the islands near India. He named the people who came out to meet him Indians, and he claimed the land for Spain, because the Queen of Spain had given him money to buy his ships. After Columbus returned home, other Spanish adventurers called conquistadors followed his sea route to India. They realized that Columbus hadn't reached India at all. He had found an entirely new land. And this new land held something more exciting than spices. The native people of South America wore gold jewelry. They offered the conquistadors gold and silver ornaments, and they told stories about a king called El Dorado, or in English, the Man of Gold, who was so rich that he wallowed in gold dust every day. When Philip II heard these stories, he decided that Spain needed this gold. So he granted Spanish conquistadors special contracts called encomiendas. The encomiendas gave the conquistadors permission to sail to South America and take all its gold. Of course, South America wasn't a big empty country filled with gold. Native South American tribes called Aztecs, Mayans, and Incas already lived there. But Philip II announced that Spain could claim South America because the tribes who lived there were not Christians. God has given all of the world to the Pope. One royal decree explained, and the Pope has given these new lands to the King of Spain. Not everyone in Spain agreed that God wanted Spain to have South America's gold. Many Christian priests preached sermons against Philip's encomiendas, but the conquistador ignored these priests. At first, they took jewelry away from the native tribes. Then they learned that bits of gold were mixed into the sand of the cold mountain streams. So they began to pan gold out of these streams. They crouched over the icy water with metal pans and dipped the pans down into the sand beneath the stream's surface, filling them about half full. Then they held the pans in the current, letting the water run over the sand while they shook the pan gently and down. The rushing water washed the sand out while the heavy gold sank to the bottom. But panning for gold didn't make the conquistadors rich enough. So the Spanish began to dig mines in the ground, looking for a rock called quartz. That often has little lines of gold running through it. Miners hacked quartz out of the mines with iron axes, carried the rocks up to the surface, crushed them into powder, and heated the powder over a fire. The gold melted and ran off into molds where it hardened into coins or gold bars called ingots. The mines started to pour out gold and silver as well. In all, the Spanish took $500 billion worth of gold and silver out of South America. Think for a moment about the number 5 billion. Are you thinking about the number 5 billion? If you could count day and night, it would take you 155 years to count to 5 billion. And if you could lay 5 billion pennies side by side, you would have to have a line of pennies that wrapped all the way around the earth more than 7 times. They took a lot of gold. Now imagine 100 times as many. It would take you 15,000 years to count to 500 billion, counting day and night. And your line of 500 billion pennies would wrap around the earth 700 times. If you had $500 billion, you could buy a 10-speed bicycle for every single person in the world. Okay. Spanish law declared that the king got a share of every load of gold brought from the New World. South American gold made Philip II the richest king in the world, and his people prospered too. Thousands and thousands of poor Spanish men and women traveled to South America and grew rich. God has given me silver, one Spanish settler wrote home from South America. I am rich and honored here. Who would make me go back to Spain and live in poverty? So many Spanish came to South America that part of the continent became known as New Spain. But while the Spanish prospered, the native South Americans suffered. The Spanish forced them to work long, miserable hours mining gold. Men spent months in the damp darkness of the mines. Women panned for gold and pounded quartz into powder. Even children spent their days gathering rocks and carrying them to the surface of the mines. And the Spanish also brought slaves from Africa to work in the South American mines. Working hard, eating little, catching diseases from the conquistadors, thousands of African and native South Americans grew sick and died. Dead slaves are buried every day in big piles, one Spanish onlooker wrote home. South American gold brought riches and power to Spain and to Philip, but it brought misery to South America. That is the end of chapter 1.